Hello everyone, welcome to the Visual Shader Graph workshop. So this is the first time we're using Connect to do some streaming. We've been doing some streaming on Twitch before. I don't know if you've been there before. Let me mute. And so please let us know how you like this, how you like Connect. The hope is that you can all connect with each other, and it's a good place to hang out. The advantage is that I can put the recording up after I've finished, and we can keep the chat after the thing's finished, so it's a way we can keep a record of what's going on. Please let me know if the audio feedback is finished. Great, it's finished. So type away in the chat as you're going. Jay Santos is there as well, so he can help. He's the evangelist in Singapore, and he can help answer questions, and I'll jump into chat every now and then and answer some questions as well. And we'll put a survey at the end so you can give us some feedback on the session as well. So this is an introduction to the shader graph. It's a bit hard to take the shader graph by itself. We have a whole bunch of new features coming out in Unity, and a lot of them are kind of joined together in some way. So what I need to do first in this session is just do a little bit of backtracking to tell you about some of the other tied-in features, and then we'll get back to the shader graph. And the other thing I need to do is I need to give some caveats. First of all the things I'm talking about now are in beta or experimental, so don't use them in your project just yet. And it's going to take some time for us to change over and for asset store things to change over. It's all exciting and necessary changes for us to modernize and to keep Unity at the front. But there will be some changes going over. But the other important thing to mention also is that all these changes are off by default. If you want to just keep Unity as you've always been using it, you can just ignore all these features for the moment. But let's back up and give some context. The first thing here is the shader graph. I'll show you it in action actually. Let's press play on this and I'll show you. This is the repository I linked earlier on. It's our shader graph examples, and we can see a bunch of shaders running there. Just some examples to get you started, different things. There's a dissolve shader, a cutout shader, some ramps, the rim shader that we're going to be making today, a hologram shader. These shaders really only rely on our new feature called the scriptable render pipeline. So the scriptable render pipeline is us taking our renderer and exposing it to C#. So this is a huge step forward. One, because forward and deferred rendering out of box isn't really enough, and command buffers isn't really enough for you to customize to the level that you'd like to customize, and modern graphics pipelines have changed enough that it's become a little bit old now. So we want to make it possible for you to update and change these. So we've made our render pipeline scriptable, and we're going to provide two default pipelines, a lightweight one, which would be great for mobile and VR, and a high definition one, which is where everything's turned up to the max. If you've seen the Book of the Dead demo, then that's done in our high definition pipeline. So you don't need to know the details of all this. I just wanted to give you some context to the scriptable graph before we get into it. The scriptable, the shader graph relies on the lightweight scriptable render pipeline. I will try and speak up into the chat a little bit. My volume is on max, and let's see how we go. So scriptable render pipeline, I'm just going to quickly show you what that means before we get back into the shader graph. What that means is I have an asset, and I can actually right click here, and when I click on create, I get the option to create a render pipeline. So at the moment I only have the lightweight option. You can make your own one, or you can use some of ours. And now that I have that asset, there's these options here. So these options here are simpler, and there's fewer of them than our usual rendering settings, because it's a simpler pipeline. If I go to edit, project settings, and then go to graphics, I have the ability to set a render pipeline in here, and that changes all the settings in here because I'm not using the default renderer anymore. I'm using this new renderer. So let's have a look I'm going to show you briefly what the code looks like. This is diving deeper probably than necessary, but just to show you a little bit what this looks like. Here's the actual lightweight pipeline. All this is, we provide the code for you so you can go and modify and get examples. This is actually the code that's running right now. And so when we want to do a render, we go through each camera and we do some culling. So for instance here, if you had a game that didn't need culling, you could just comment this out. We do a light pass and a shadow pass. So again, if you want to do your light or your camera sorting differently, some people like to sort their cameras based on the area of an object rather than a center point, for instance. You could do that. We do a depth pass and a forward pass. So you could add another pass in here for maybe doing a lightweight geometry pass. So it gives you that sort of control. So that's scriptable render pipelines. Now, how do you actually get that? How do you actually get that in your project? Well, we have this other new feature, another new thing in beta called the Unity Hub. If you open up the Unity Hub, or you make a new project, what you get is you get this U dialog here, and you've probably seen this before. You give it a name where you want to put it. If you're in 2017, you can choose 3D or 2D. But when we go to 2018.1, we have this template drop down, which gives us a high definition, a lightweight, and a lightweight VR options as well, and 3D Ultra. So templates is also a new feature we've brought in to make it easier to get a new project set up. So for instance, if I selected a 3D Ultra setting, I would get a standard 3D project with light probes, full screen effects, and some other and a default scene set up, so I get started more quickly. If you want to use the scriptable render, if you want to use the shader graph that we're going to be dealing with today, then choose the lightweight preview template, and what that's going to do is that's going to automatically include the lightweight render pipeline for you and the shader graph as well. So let's have a look at that. So one more feature I want to talk to you about before we actually get into the shader graph is, I'm talking about lots of new things here like render pipelines, we have our post-processing, shader graph. What's happening here in Unity is we're getting a lot of different projects, and sometimes we have those on GitHub. In the case of our post-processing stack, that's on GitHub, and sometimes they're in our asset store, and it becomes a bit of a pain to manage. So we've introduced a package manager, which makes it easier to manage these sorts of things. At the moment, if I go to the window menu, you see there's a package manager entry there, and when I select that, I get a list of packages that I can look up. And so when I use that template to create a new project, I will get the shader graph and a lightweight rendering pipeline include. Okay, again, probably more detail than you needed or wanted, but I think it's sometimes useful to know the context. I'll emphasize again, the shader graph only works with the lightweight render pipeline at the moment, and it's only ever going to work with our new render pipeline settings. So it's going to be something when you create a new game using a render pipeline, you're going to be using the shader graph, and that is not going to be compatible with our default renderer. Okay, so let's have a look at our shader graph. So as I mentioned, we have this example library here, which has the shader graphs in action. We're actually going to recreate this second from the left shader here, which is a rim lighting shader. Let's jump in and do that. So one thing to notice is I don't have in my window menu a shader editor. There's no new window here that lets us edit shaders. It's a slightly different window model to what we have before. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go to my project. I'm going to right click, and there's actually a create option for creating a shader graph. So I'm going to create that shader graph, and let's just call it rim lighting. And now when I double click that, I get this window here. So this is actually our editor for our shader graph. So a few things to notice straight away is we have down the bottom right, we have the output. So at the moment it's just going to be a dull grey. We have this blackboard here, which I'll get to later on. But here in the middle, this PBR master is the node that gives us our final appearance for our object. So this is a lot like a standard shader. We have the usual channels, albedo, normal emission, etc. We have a metallic or a specular workflow, an opaque or a transparent result. So this is the shader output, and what we're going to do is we want to plug different things into here. So let's have a look at this albedo. I can just change a color here, and I can give that a color, and it gives us the result. That's easy enough. I can change normal, emission, etc. So what we want to do is we want to add some rim lighting. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to use a node here called a Fresnel node. So here I right click and I can click on create node. And so we have all these different nodes. There's about 100 different nodes here at the moment. So there's a lot of variety. But the one that I'm going to use now is the Fresnel effect. And here we have it here, so we can see it takes a normal and a view direction. The view direction is filled in by the pipeline when we render. And we have this power option here, so I can make the power go up and down to get a different sort of effect. So let's grab the output of that Fresnel effect and plug it into emission. So now we can see that we get now the Fresnel effect around the edge of our red rim lighting, which is great. So one thing is that it's very hard to visualize what this is going to look like. We're going to put this on our player model, and right now we have a sphere. So down here in the bottom right, I can actually change the model in the preview window. So I'm going to go and choose the player here and get this rim lighting, and now I have a much better idea about what that's going to look like when I get my final result. Great, so this is our first stage. Let's save this. You always have to save your asset first. We'll save the shader, and then we'll go apply it to our model. So I'm going to drag that one other way. So I'm actually going to start from scratch here. I'm going to create a new scene. I'm going to drag my player, put it in the scene. So right now I have a player here. Let's have a look at the materials on this player, the ones that are there already. And we see right now here, the shader that this is using is actually the lightweight pipeline standard shader. So these new pipelines I mentioned before have their own types of standard shaders. You can imagine that the HD standard shader requires a lot more inputs than the lightweight one does. So we have different shaders here. We still have the standard shader here, but they're not compatible anymore. So at the moment, this has got the lightweight standard. So there's a question in chat about can we code these shaders manually rather than using shader graph? Before this editor appeared, yes, you had to write shaders in a text editor by hand. So this is a step up for that. You can now do it visually. So let's apply our new rim shader. So the shaders we create with the shader graph appear in this graphs folder here. And we see where there's a whole bunch here from the examples that have been created in here, but our one that we've created here is called rim lighting. So I select that, and there we go. We have rim lighting applied here. So that's a good first step, but we need to look at this a little bit more. If I look at the player material here, there's no options here. I just get what I'm given. I can't apply the rim lighting at all. I have no textures. So there's a few little improvements we need to make. First step here, let's look at how we can give the user control over the power of the rim lighting. At the moment it's set here within the editor and it's not editable. So what I'm going to do here is you can see this window we have. This is called the blackboard, and you can add things in here. I'll click the plus button. You can see you can add a variety of vectors, color, texture, cube map, and Boolean. So these are the equivalent of texture properties. So if you've written any shaders before, then you'll be familiar with these properties. But if you haven't, this is a way that we can set properties within our shader externally. I'll show you what we mean. So we might have different purposes of this. So a vector 1 really is just one number or one float. A vector 2 might be useful for UV coordinates. A vector 3 might be a direction vector. And a vector 4 might be RGBA. You can use these for whatever you'd like. And of course, a color, a texture, cube map, and Boolean. So let's add a vector 1. And I'm going to call this rim power. So when I have rim power here, I'll set the default here to 1. And I'll click save here. And now after I've clicked save, I go back to this material. And we can see that there's a rim power setting in here now. I haven't hooked it up to anything, so when I change it doesn't do anything. But you can see as I've added that rim power, it's now available for the user to change. So let's use it. So all I have to do here is grab the rim power property from the blackboard and just drag it into the shader graph editor, and there it is. So I have a rim power. You can see in brackets after here it says 1, which just means it has one element, which is going to be this power. And I can drag that and then just drop it into this power slot here. Great. So there it is, rim power, sets to 1. One more nice thing I can do here is there's a mode drop down here. So the mode, I can drop that down here and set it to slider instead. I want to give this a range of values. So I'm going to set this from, say, 1 to 3. I'll save again. We always have to save after we've made a change. And now we have a slider here. So I can have a slider that goes from 1 all the way up to 3, and I can then adjust the rim to be what I would like it to be. So again, if you've written shaders, this is all very familiar to you. It's just in graphics form. So there's a couple of questions in chat. One is, are these shaders going to be less efficient than when you hand code? Now, these shaders get compiled into shader code that you would write. So if anything, they're going to be more efficient because say this Fresnel effect will be written by a very experienced shader guru who knows what they're doing, and they're going to have the right sort of precision on the numbers, and may do it slightly more efficiently, but I wouldn't expect any inefficiency from these shaders. It's really about what you do with them. And thanks, Brad. Yes, the answer to the power is it's just something that's used specifically on this Fresnel effect. It controls the strength of that Fresnel. So yeah, me calling this rim power has no effect. That's just the name I've given it. The Fresnel effect, this node here has these 3 parameters: normal, view, direction, and power. I can plug whatever I like in there. Now, so let's keep going with this. So we now have user control over the rim power. What I'd like them to be able to do now is to change the color of this effect. At the moment, it's just a white effect. So I'm going to go here and I'm going to go to the blackboard and I'm going to click plus, and I'm going to add a color parameter here. So let's call this rim color. And I'll default it to something lurid so we can see it working. So let's just make that completely green. Now, how are we going to combine this? So same idea, we're just going to drag the rim color out and drop it, and it's automatically created a new node for me. A rim color, and it's got 4 elements here, RGBA. So what I aim to do here is get the result of the Fresnel effect and multiply it here by this rim color. If I get the rim color output and I drag it out and I drop it, what I do is I get a list of things that I can use in that. So it's a subset of what I can use. So what I'd like to find here is multiply. I choose this multiply. So multiply here, I have a multiply node. It takes in 2 inputs, 2 vector 4s, and it's going to multiply them together. So I've got a rim color here. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the output of the Fresnel effect then plug that into the emission. So one thing nice here is that you can see every node has a preview. So we can see what we're doing as we're going. So this is really helpful for shader debugging. When you're doing things, when you're writing a shader, you know anyone who's written a shader has probably done this, pumping things out as a color to debug various stages. This makes it easy for us to see what's going on as we write our shaders. So we'll save the asset and see our progress. Chuan would love your feedback on Unity Connect if you want to give it to us. So coming back to where we're at, we now have our player. Select the player material. I now have a rim color, defaults to green, and I can now go in and set it to whatever I want. So there's a question here of about what does an add in a property do? So yes, there's two steps here. When I add a property to the blackboard, as soon as I add it to the blackboard, it appears in the material editor and it lets me change it. It lets the user change that. So this is a way you can expose something. If you've done any C# coding, this is like making a public property. It just makes it appear in the editor. It doesn't do anything else. So for it to actually be of use to anything, then you actually have to drag it out, create a node and wire it in. Otherwise, you're just going to be changing that number. So there's two steps there, exposing it and then actually doing something with it. So we've got a couple more steps here. Well, the next step here is that I'd like to be add a texture. So I missed a question before about can you add your own code in? Now, that's a really good question. I haven't actually looked this up. I know that there is, that is, I'm not sure if it's in this current version, but it is definitely something you'll be able to do, which is just right click, create, say like a script node, and then you'll just be able to put shader code inside that. And then you can plug that into whatever you want. I'm not sure exactly how that will work in practice, but I do know that that's a feature that we're going to support. Is Shader Graph going to be compatible with substances? Like as in Substance the program, or materials from that? Procedural textures, is that the question? Maybe you could clarify that a little bit about what you're asking there. So global properties, that's a good question. I don't know that off the top of my head, to tell you the truth, whether you can create a node and get a global property. So will we be able to create a library of preset groups of nodes? So there is a thing called a subgraph, and I'll actually show you this later on when I have a look at some of these other example shaders. So yes, you can do that and reuse it, and I'll show you that later on. So substance materials, I don't know off the top of my head, Will, about whether we're going to support substance files. You may have heard that Substance is moving from being inbuilt part of Unity back to being an asset store plugin, but Substance is still very much supported, and whether it supports substance materials and you can pull that into a shader, I don't know. That's something I'm going to have to research. Okay, so a few questions for me to follow up on there. Global properties, substance files, and how are we going to support code within a shader node? Great questions. So is this stream going to be posted to any of the Twitch channels? This is a trial for us using Connect with YouTube streaming. And if it works, we'll probably switch and stay here, and we won't be doing any more Twitch TV. So we'll rely on your feedback, Jonathan, whether you know whether this is a better format or not. Okay. Okay, going to get back to adding some more nodes in here, and I'll come back to questions in a second. So far we have a Fresnel effect and a color multiplier here, so you can put a color and change the power on that. At the moment we've just hard coded a red color in for albedo. What we would like to do is look up a texture. So we'll start with this again. So we go back to the blackboard, and then I'm going to click a plus, and we have a texture option here. So I'm going to call this texture albedo. Now I can give this a default texture. I'm going to find the player diffuse map, plug that in. Now this, just to emphasize this, I'm going to save this asset. I've added something to the blackboard. I'm not doing anything with it. Nothing's going to change. But when I save it and I come back here, now I have this texture set in here, which I can set to whatever I'd like. So that adds the property, doesn't do anything with it. So the steps are, we get our albedo, we're going to drag this out, and this creates a node. So this creates a texture node. We now have to look up this texture. So when I drag out the output of this albedo, I get a filtered list of everything I can do with it. It's a much shorter list this time, so I can say create a normal texture from it. I can do a triplanar projection, but what I really want here is to sample this texture. So again, if you've written shader code, this is just your you have a sampler, and then you do a text 2D. You look it up. This is what this does. It's equivalent of, and I have these outputs here. I can get the RGBA channels as a vec4, or I can get each of the channels individually. There is a bunch of swizzling nodes, so you can swizzle these nodes if you'd like. But right now I can just drag this RGBA folder, node output node and drag it onto albedo. Notice even though this is a 3, it'll just drop the alpha channel. I could actually go and drag the alpha here and put it to the alpha channel here if I wanted to keep alpha. And there we go. We've put in a texture. We'll save. Jump back to our asset here. So here I'm going to have to put in the player texture, the player diffuse texture, and now we've got this lurid yellow. I'll ramp it down a little bit of rim lighting, and so now we have a little bit of rim lighting on our character. Yes, so Connor, yeah, I understood it was a shader set global. That's a really good question. I don't know if you can access it. I will actually just jump back into here and just do a quick node search. You never know. There's no global result, so I don't know. That's a bit of research for me. So here we go. I'm just going to review this shader quickly, and then I'm going to have a look at some other examples. So we've completed our rim shader now. We're using this Fresnel effect here. We have a property here that's user editable to change its power. We have a property here to change its color. We multiply those together, and that changes the emission. We have a texture here which we sample, and then we plug the RGB channels into albedo and the alpha channel into the alpha channel here. We get previews at every node, so we can see what we're doing, and then we get a final output down here, so we can play around here with if we change our defaults here. So I can change the default here to 3, and I can see the preview changes as well. So I can change my defaults to be the best defaults that I'd like, and get that result before I click save and go back into the game, so I don't have to keep flicking backwards and forwards. Okay, so we've completed this shader. Let's have a look at some of the other example shaders we have here. I'm going to switch back to the scene and throw away these changes. So I'm going to go back to this player scene I was in before. And we have all these shaders here. Let's have a look at this dissolve effect. So I have a shader graphs folder here with all these shaders in it. One of those is, where is it gone? Texture dissolve. So if I open that up, let's have a quick look at that. So we have our output shader here. This one's a little more complicated, but not too crazily so. So we have our blackboard here, which is with a bunch of inputs, our albedo, normal emission, our dissolve texture and dissolve amount. And effectively what we do is we get our dissolve amount, and we multiply it by our texture sample to get this result. This one actually does a border as well, so we get that twice, once with the border added and once not with the border added. We subtract the result to actually get the border there, and we multiply that by an edge color to get this nice red effect here. When we add those together, then we get a nice edge effect. We get some alpha inside the holes and no change on the outside of the holes. So what's the thing you can learn from here? Well, one thing here is people were asking before about, hey, can you group these together and use them again? Well, here we have a subgraph. So you can imagine if I wanted to do a texture sample and I had to sample the albedo, the normal, the emission, and the metallic, that graph gets quite large pretty quickly, and I have to recreate that often in every shader. So there's a subgraph here that does that. You just plug in your various textures, and it plugs all those as 4 outputs. And I can get those 4 outputs and plug them back into the result. So this is a nice example of a subgraph that's going to save some time. And one thing that's nice is that you'll be able to also share these shader graphs. So when you download various asset packs and it has shader graphs, I'll have reusable components like this. And this is one of the aims, is at the moment it's quite hard to share shader code and reuse it, but if we have subgraphs, then that's definitely something that you can share more easily. Something else I want to show you. So that's a really cool node there. I want to use that. So I've got, this really deserves 2 monitors, but I've got my rim power shader here, and I've got my dissolve shader here on the right. What I'd like to do is actually use this handy little sampler here, because I would like to get the normals and emission and metallic out. So I'm going to go and grab all these nodes. I'm going to copy them. I'm going to come back up to my rim light shader, and I'm going to paste them in over here somewhere. Where did they go? They went over here. And then, so I've got that node in here, so you can copy and paste between shader graphs, which is really awesome. And now I could just put a texture sampler in here and then put the result in there as well. So subgraphs and copying and pasting between shader graphs is going to make it really easy to start reusing stuff. So there's a question about, can these custom shaders be applied to 2D objects? Yes, these are just plain ordinary shaders, just like before. So yes, you can apply these to 2D as well. Okay, so let's have a look at another example. So save my rim light there with my new albedo lookup. I'll get rid of this guy. And so just to show you a different one, there's this pretty cool hologram shader. I'll press play here so you can see it running. So on the right here, we can see a hologram shader. So the interesting thing about this one is that it has a time factor. We can see the holograms going up and down over time. So just to give you another example of what you can pull into a shader. this shader here has, where is it? Somewhere there's a time node, if I can find it back. No, it's part of the UV scrolling. Smooth step. Property. Because I'm back in the rim shader for some reason. I clicked on the wrong one. Okay, that's better. So we have a time node here, which is just like your time inbuilt parameter that you can plug in. Okay, so I might dig into a little bit about what Jay's talking about there. So we have a thing called a master node. So at the moment I've been using something called a PBR master, which is a equivalent to the surface shader. It has albedo, normo, emission, specular, all that sort of stuff. It's going to be lit and all that sort of stuff. So that's not necessarily what you want for 2D. So there are other types of master nodes here as well. I'm not sure how to create this off the top of my head. Jay might be able to throw in there, but you can have a different sort of master here, which is an unlit shader. It's maybe when I create the shader graph, I specify it. So I encourage you to download these examples and have a dig around and have a look at the types of nodes that you can use. I know I still have a lot more research to do, and some of the questions today have pointed me in some directions that I can look up as well, as in terms of global variables and substance and what other things are going to be available. So when I copied and pasted the shaders between the blackboard, where do you add the defaults of the pasted properties? So I copied and pasted a node that relied on things within the blackboard. I would actually have to go add those properties to the blackboard and actually recreate those nodes. So maybe it wasn't the best example for me to paste over. I would have to go and add the normal and metallic texture properties to the blackboard, drag those in as a node, and then hook them up to that subgraph I took over. One Rat Games, can you tell me what you'd like to see in another shader graph webinar? I have recorded this one, so we can go back and have a look at it. And we'll be holding lots more of these as well. This is really just a heads up. Like I said, back to the start of the stream, this is quite a large change, because a shader graph is one thing, but the fact that it relies on a render pipeline is another. So there's going to be some change over time here as we help asset store authors move over, as new games get started. I don't think this is not something you're going to do mid-project. It's all still in beta and preview status as well. So this is really, the first of a heads up and us training you as to what this is going to do. I'll definitely do more in-depth sessions as time goes on, as well as going to user groups and that sort of stuff. So I've got plans to go to a bunch of user groups around Australia after GDC, so we can talk about some of these announcements, and feel free to come up to me and say hi there and ask more questions as well. Vertex shaders, that's a very good question. I don't know the details of that at the moment, so sorry Connor, that's going to have to be another thing I do some more research on. I know the answer is yes, I just don't know the specifics of it, so I can't give you a demonstration right now. While questions are coming through, what I'm going to do is just going to ask you to give me some feedback on this session, whether you like Connect, whether this session was useful, how we can make it better for you. So I'm just going to pop up a survey link now. Really appreciate if you could fill that in for us. It helps us improve what we do and lets us know if this is useful for you. And feel free to stay here, please, and keep asking questions. And I'll do my best to answer them. So the only master nodes I know of are the PBR and the unlit one. But like I said, I do know that there is some sort of vertex path for these shaders. I just don't know what the details of it just yet. So I'll come back on another session and go deeper into that. Thanks, Jeff. Thanks, Connor. And Dominic and Chuan. So if you have an existing project, is it possible to switch over to the new rendering system, to these new render pipes? It is, but your shaders are not going to be unlikely to be compatible unless they're completely unlit. So it's actually interesting to look at the lightweight shader code and just see what it sets in terms of shader globals and all this kind of stuff. All that's open source, so you can just grab it. So there may be some shaders you have to redo if you change a render pipeline. Cool. Unfortunately, I won't be at GDC this year, but I don't know if you've heard that we're going to open up the Unity office, which is about a block away from GDC. So there's a blog post on that recently. Check that, because you should reserve a spot if you'd like to see the Unity office and chat to someone there, because we can't fit everyone in. So if you're going to GDC, check out the Unity blog, go reserve a spot to visit the Unity office. Is DirectX 11 tessellation in the lightweight pipe? Again, I don't know off the top of my head. There is, I'm going to pop this in, there is a blog post on the render pipeline. I think Jay may have already put this in the chat, but it has some of the breakdown between what's supported and what's not supported. There's quite a lot of different features, so have a look at that. And I'll also put the manual page in as well, and it's going to give you a breakdown of what's, whether tessellation's supported and what type of lighting's supported, etc. Free lunch, that's right. And don't forget the beer taps. Unity has beer on tap in their kitchen. I don't know if they'll let you add it, but you can always try. Thanks for coming, Ruben. So while people are posting questions or disappearing, whatever, just want to let you know that the Pro Builder got released today. It's part of Unity now, so if you're doing level design or want to do some vertex coloring, a whole bunch of stuff, that's available, which is really awesome. This is the year of huge changes, and also nested prefabs. It's on the roadmap. Are we going to do a Scriptable Render Pipelines webinar soon? I would like to. It's almost like you're a teacher again. I know. I've recognised it's very nice to see a few of my ex-students back here. They couldn't get enough. Oh yeah, that's another thing I forgot to mention, presets. Presets are in beta as well. We have everything, like I said. Light direction, not available. Okay, so maybe Brendan's asking about presets. I'll get back to Brendan's question first, but I jumped onto presets. Presets in the editor now, you can actually set, say, a light up how you'd like it, or a camera FOV or whatever. set that as a preset, and then you could set that as default, or even a texture importer. So when you then drag a new texture in, it takes in your presets rather than the defaults. So that's going to be really easy. It's going to be super useful for new projects. But Brendan's asking about things like light direction would be available in a forward pipeline, but not available in deferred. So there will be differences between them. I'm not sure I'm quite getting that question. Say like the lightweight pipeline might only support vertex lights or a certain number of vertex lights, for instance. But you have to look up the feature matrix to see what's supported and what's not supported. Estimated release date for 2018.1. So soon, very soon. Around GDC sounds like a good time to me. Of course, we can never know for sure, but I'm sure that would be a good date for them to launch on. We do have a release schedule, but sometimes you find ship stoppers and that kind of stuff. Oh, and Tim's here as well. Hi, Tim. (2019) So yeah, the version, I don't know if this new version number is confusing, but we do year numbers, so there will be, we hope to have 4 releases a year, so we should get up to 2018.4 hopefully before we get to 2019. So are we done developing how the nodes look? No. In fact, the package manager I showed you before, I know that's going to look completely different. If you have feedback, there's a forum. I should find the link to the forum, and you should jump on and give your feedback. But this is, like I said, this is still in beta, and it's still very much collecting feedback. So if there's anything that bothers you, please let us know. So is it going to be annoying to update mid-project, like the change to 5.5? We've had some big jumps in versions and that's really thrown people off. And this is part of the reason why we now don't do version numbers in the same way. We're trying to release once a quarter, so the changes aren't quite so massive. And so we don't have to have a six dot release, which has a billion features that breaks everything. I mean, you can see now there's some huge changes coming in. We're going to roll that out steadily rather than lump it all in at once. So will there be breaking changes? Perhaps. I mean, maybe it's perfect, but we like a more iterative style to reduce the impact. And also all the stuff I've talked about, like I said, is not on by default. So you can keep rolling on with your current projects, and you can ignore all the stuff and pretend it doesn't exist. So you won't break your projects in that way either. Okay, that's good feedback about not liking little boxes sticking out. I'm not sure what the alternative would be, because that's where you set the values, but again, post on the forums with ideas and suggestions. That'd be really great. Well, will the shader graph full version be included in 2018.1? Will it still be in beta? Well, 2018.1 is still in beta, so it is into the shader graph is available. Okay, let me start that again. You can grab the shader graph and make it work, and it will work with 2018.1. They're both in beta at the moment. You need to use a template or a package manager to grab shader graph, and yes, they're both in beta at the moment. So, do you have the ability to scroll in and out? Well, you can in the animator window now. That was one of the changes we snuck in recently, and yes, a 2-finger on my trackpad scroll up and down scrolls in and out. So yes, you can scroll in and out, and you can do that in the animator window as well now. can I access the shader graph from the inspector for the object in the material section? Yes, you can. It's just an ordinary material and behaves exactly the same way as it did before. Yep. So no changes to materials. They're exactly the same. So you can go to your game object and pop open and hide the materials down the bottom. Yep, zooming's a thing. You can do that all over the place. So you can alt and click and drag as well to move around the window. You don't have to necessarily use scroll bars if that's, for me on my trackpad, a 2-finger scroll zooms in and out. I'm not sure what the key combo is. Yeah, we actually do have this has been a recent change, fairly recent, we have a user interface group that goes around and just tries to make things better. So some of the little changes that are happening are because of that group have come in and said, hey, that's not right, let's fix it up. And they're looking at little things, but also big workflow things as well. As Unity gets more features, it all becomes more complicated. So we think a lot about how workflows and how we can help new and experienced users navigate and do that sort of stuff. Will there ever be a Unity office in Australia? The arcade is the Unity office in Australia. Maybe. There's three Unity employees in Australia now. It's not quite enough to justify. We'll probably need to get quite a few more, or a few more than that. And so it really depends. Accessibility options would be nice. If you feel we've missed accessibility, yeah, please again post on forums. I agree that's super important, and I know that group I was just talking about before would be really interested in hearing about your feedback on accessibility. Favorites list? No, there isn't, but that's another awesome idea. Feedback form is, you should see it right now. It says a thank you, and then it has a tiny URL link underneath on your screen. I'll pop it in the chat as well. Make it so you don't have to type it in. That'll make it a little bit easier to. Oh, did I even? It's a different link, same result, if you save you some typing. Colorblind testing would be amazing. What if that's doable in a shader? Oh, right, that's interesting. So you could change shader variables, change the appearance of objects, and run some tests to see how people perceive and respond to that. That's a great idea. Yeah, okay. I'm going to vote on that one. Some of these changes, it's interesting, some of these changes that seem trivial, sometimes they're relying on other features as well. So in particular, something like a font size change. We're actually, the way the UI is rendering has completely changed without people knowing. We're moving away from this IM GUI approach to more a CSS type approach. And so a lot of the windows in Unity have actually been wrapped in this new renderer, and we're slowly kind of changed them over. 2011, ouch, yeah, that's really bad. So yeah, some of it relies on us kind of redoing this UI, because as soon as we've got a CSS-based approach, then it becomes easier for us to do font size changes, well, without having to redo everything. So I don't know, but that may be part of the reason why it's something that is upvoted so much. Is also not necessarily looked at. I mean, there's a lot that goes into how changes are made, but I'm with you on those sorts of accessibility things are really important. So for Mac, height, DPI is a thing. It's not for Windows, and again, I'm not clear on the reasons why that's lagged behind. But again, another thing I'm happy to vote on issues and make noise about, but not sure why that one hasn't been picked up. It could be coming through soon. I'm not sure. It's there's so many things coming through. Sometimes it's hard to keep up, quite honestly. But if you've seen something about that, I'd love to know about it. Yeah, that's interesting feedback about Shader Forge, about having shortcuts and key combinations to open nodes and list them nodes. I know there were some in there already. I just didn't remember what they were for this session. So check the documentation, but I'm sure that will be a thing. Okay, I'm going to wrap it up soon. One thing is, now that you're all on Connect anyway, make sure that you follow and like each other so you can stay in contact. I will post a video up to this page as well later on. I'm not sure exactly the mechanics of that at the moment, but we'll get that happening. And thanks for all your questions and feedback. It's been really great.